Hi, 7th and 8th grade. We are continuing on chapter 23, Which Way America, and we are on note 65. So open your books to your note 65 and we'll get started. We're going to talk about Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the very first woman ever to be to serve as justice on the High Court. So she was a justice on the Supreme Court. This was actually a challenge given to Ronald Reagan he was talking to a man who was one of his supporters and a close friend, and he was also talking to the man's wife, who was not a supporter of Reagan. And one of her big issues was there were no women on the Supreme Court, and Reagan said, that's a really good point. And so one of the first things he did when he had the opportunity to put a Supreme Court justice on the court, he chose Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the best qualified candidate as well. She quite frankly said, the power I exert on the court depends on the power of my arguments, not on my gender. Women had been practicing law for a very long time by this time, and she's just came right out with it and said, this has nothing to do with, I'm being put on this court because I'm a woman. She says, I'm actually being put on the court and I'm a woman. Okay, it's not a because, but this is one of the things Reagan took into account when he was choosing who was going to be on the Supreme Court. He was looking at the best qualified candidates, and it was a woman, and he said, you know what, you need to be on there. And so he put her on the Supreme Court. She had to go through a Senate hearing first, just like all Supreme Court justices do. Okay, as president, Ronald Reagan represented several things, traditional values. That doesn't mean he was absolutely perfect. He was not. And in fact, there were some people who had issues with him in his past. For instance, he was part of Old Hollywood. He had been a union representative and a union leader in Hollywood. He was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He had been married multiple times, twice. He had divorced his first wife and married his second wife. He had children from both marriages and was trying to make a combined family work. So he was going through a lot of the same things that most Americans were having issues with at the time. And you had some people who said, well, we shouldn't have a divorced president. And everybody else was like, okay, but that's about half of the nation at this point is divorced and having to deal with mingled families. So it would make sense that our president would be representative of that. But he did believe in traditional values. Despite the fact that he was divorced and remarried, that didn't mean he wasn't a traditional father. He did have a hand in raising all of his children. Some of them grew up to be very, very conservative, like their father, and some grew to do the exact opposite, just like every other family, became very, very liberal, considering themselves politically correct, not liberal. But he also believed in less government regulation of private property. He believed that if it was your property, you paid for it, you should be able to do what you want with that property. He wanted to return the country to both patriotism, which is a love for your country, and military strength. And so he was really pushing these ideas that were traditional American ideas and encouraging people to embrace them once again. Okay. American people, when it came time for Reagan to serve his second term, and then he retired because the Constitution Amendment 25 basically made a term limit for presidents that they could only serve 2 terms or 10 years total. So when he stepped down, he immediately said, you know what, my vice president is an excellent candidate, and he promoted the vice president and said, you guys really should vote for him. So it made sense. Here was a man who had been part of the president's cabinet. The vice president has been part of the president's cabinet since the days of Coolidge. I almost said Coleridge. It's a different guy. Since the days of Coolidge. And this guy also had a background with the CIA. He had been former head of the CIA. He was with the president when it came to discussing how to treat communism as it spread throughout the world and how to try to stop that. So this is a man who had a lot of background and a lot of experience. And so the American people trusted Reagan. They trusted the Republican Party, and they overwhelmingly elected Reagan's Vice President George H. Bush in 1988. Bush promised to continue the direction that Reagan had begun. That's one of the big reasons he was elected. In the spring of 1989, university students in China challenged their communist regime, which is really, really dangerous because communism doesn't allow for a lot of free expression of thought or of action. So these are college students who are challenging communism and saying, we don't agree. We would like democracy or at least some kind of representation in our government. This is the exact opposite of what was going on in the United States, where you have quite a few college students who are saying, we want socialism, we want communism, we want to lose our freedoms, we want to get rid of that, we want the government to take over. But the countries who are actually dealing with socialism and communism are saying, we hate it, get us out of here, and are willing to stand up in front of tanks and saying, we just won't stand for this. No one really knows what happened to this young man that's in the front. Some people say he was just run over. Others say he was arrested and was never heard of from again. The thing is, with this uprising in Tiananmen Square, this protest, there were quite a few people who went missing after this, and the families assume that their college students passed away, that they died. They were either imprisoned or killed, but the assumption is that close to several 100,000 at least were killed. So there are college students out demonstrating for freedom. They wanted freedom in Tiananmen Square, which is the square in front of the ancient palace that is now called the People's Palace. And you can see it in the bottom picture. If you look all the way to the horizon of the picture, you can see the People's Palace up there. There were about 1 million demonstrators here. So 1 million people in the country of China were standing up and saying, we don't want to be communists. We don't like communism. We want to get out of here. Communists were sent soldiers to crush the freedom demonstrators. Many were killed. Many more just went missing and were assumed dead. They even created a type of Statue of Liberty. It's not exactly like the one in the United States, but this was created by the students and was part of the protest. They wanted the same kind of liberty that they saw people in America had. Bush believed that the best way to combat communism in China was through free trade. And the conservatives who put him in the presidency all just kind of shook their heads and said, what? Really? I wasn't even a conservative at this time. And even I thought, well, that's kind of a weird thing. You know, I was very liberal during this period of time, and I thought that this was just bizarre. The best way to combat communism is through free trade. But when you think about how a communist system is set up, the only people who have an opportunity to trade are going to be the communist leadership, not the average person in China. It's all going to be controlled by the government. What really got a lot of people questioning the motivations of the president and just really trying to understand, wrap our heads around this, was the fact that this free trade agreement that he was looking at completely overlooked communist tyranny and the violation of human rights by Chinese government. The Chinese government was infamous for killing people who disagreed with them, for imprisoning people who disagreed with them, and for using prisoners for cheap or free labor, compelling them to work for the Chinese government to manufacture things. So this free trade agreement, people are looking at this and saying, aren't we just opening this up for China to use more and more slave labor? It didn't really make a whole lot of sense. Okay, south of our border, Manuel Noriega was the dictator of Panama. He terrorized the people of the nation, his own nation. But more than that, well, in addition to that, not more than that, because it's pretty awful that you can't live in your own country without a dictator ruling over you. But he was smuggling illegal drugs into the United States and by the billions of dollars. The United States had enough because he was shipping in so many different drugs, specifically cocaine. But the way Panama is situated, they could fly directly over the Gulf of Mexico and then right up into New York. And he was using a variety of different methods to get drugs into our border, and most of it was smuggling it through on pirate ships. Pirate ships aren't like the old-fashioned wooden boats; they're like speedboats. Okay, and then they would float the drugs onto the shore. They'd have other people ready to do a pickup, and so during this time, there were a lot of police and Coast Guard on the shores, off the shores of the United States, looking for these drug pirates. When that became too complicated, he even did airdrops into the United States where drugs were parachuted into our borders. There was the kind of a funny story, but there was a sheriff in Florida, one of the cities in Florida, and he was very openly and very like bombastically anti-drug, and would do drug conferences and basically try to explain to people how drugs actually hurt the nation. And he was doing an outdoor speech, and while he was speaking, a parachute full of drugs actually landed in the crowd while he was speaking and explaining that this is a real thing that's really going on. And all of a sudden there's this, drug delivery. Well, another one of the interesting things about this arrest of Noriega, the United States actually walked into their country and went to Noriega's palace and was there specifically to arrest Noriega to be on trial for the crimes he committed against the United States. And of course, he wouldn't come out. So the United States, our military started blasting heavy metal music at him 24/7 until he was so sick of it that he finally came out and he was arrested. Yeah. Okay. In Africa, because we're kind of going through headlines around the world here, Nelson Mandela, a communist leader from South Africa, was released from prison. Now, he had been in prison for a number of years, but the media, specifically the music industry and Hollywood industry, but really the music industry, they were anxious to get him out of prison, portraying him as a hero, looking at him as a moderate socialist and not necessarily a communist, even though the reason he went to prison in the first place was because he was found with plans on him for a plot for a bombing. He was involved in a terrorist organization at the time. He was arrested. He went through trial. He was put in prison. He did write letters. His wife published those letters, and he really started becoming a gentler person while in prison. His wife, on the other hand, remained outside of prison and continued her work with that same organization. When he was released from prison, he had changed quite a bit. She had not, and the two of them ended up divorcing not too long after he was taken out. But here's where the music industry comes in. And I'm speaking to you from personal experience with watching MTV. I watched a lot of MTV in my late teens and early 20s. That was like on in my house constantly, 24/7 usually. But apartheid became one of the things that MTV used to get everybody's attention away from, real life. This is a common ploy in media. They will find one thing to fixate on and they get everybody upset about it. And so you don't really ask questions about what you can do, how you can make life better for yourself just on a daily basis. Okay, like in this case, apartheid became such a huge part of MTV's programming that they even had a big concert at Wembley Stadium while Nelson Mandela was still in prison. And it was on his birthday, and they had this huge concert with all these really top acts performing at this concert as a birthday tribute to Nelson Mandela, where a lot of people didn't even know who Nelson Mandela was. He was arrested in South Africa. He was famous in South Africa, but even there, I mean, it had been so long since he was arrested, most people didn't know who he was. And the people who did know knew him as a communist terrorist. But with MTV bringing all these big acts out, and they're all talking about it's unfair the way he was arrested. They just arrested him because he was standing up against apartheid. And we'll talk about apartheid in just a second. This man deserves to be freed. Now, because MTV was so prevalent, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, it was a force to be reckoned with. People in Hollywood took up the mantle of anti-apartheid free Mandela like they were the same thing. And they were really presented as the same thing. So even in movies, movies like Scrooged, which is a retelling of the Christmas Carol, there's mention of apartheid and Nelson Mandela. On the Cosby Show, a family show from the 80s and 90s, the twin grandchildren of Bill Cosby and they don't go by the name Cosby, the Huxtables, are named Winnie and Nelson, bringing in the Mandelas there. So this became a part of our culture. It became a really huge part, but people were really looking at apartheid and the release of Mandela as being two sides of the same coin. Now, Nelson Mandela did fight against apartheid, but he was also just fighting. Okay, he was a communist terrorist. We have to remember that. But he did change in jail, and I think we need to remember that as well. So let's talk about what apartheid is. And do I have it? Yep. Apartheid was South Africa's policy of racial segregation. South Africa, from very early on in the 1500s, was first developed by the Dutch as their own little enclave. So there were people who were living there natively, African people living in South Africa from multiple different tribes. But the Dutch used that enclave or the little bay off the shore as a place to offer people a chance to restock their ships as they went around Africa and into Asia for trading purposes. So the Dutch built this enclave first. When gold was discovered, the British basically took that enclave over. I'm sorry, it wasn't the gold yet. Sorry, I jumped ahead. The British took over the Dutch enclave when they were expanding their empire. The Dutch ended up having to move further inland. They were still farming. They were still providing goods that would be given to people on ships, supplying that. But now South Africa actually belonged to the British. Though the Dutch who moved further inland discovered gold on their new property, and the English followed them, and that started a war between those two groups called the Boer War. It was a very kind of nasty little war. After that, you still had some Boers living near South Africa, or in that territory anyway, but they had few and far between farms. Then you had the British, who were really in the enclave themselves and running the cities. But the people who kind of got left behind or left out of everything were the natives who were originally there. And so it started this whole racist hierarchy in South Africa. So you had the British on top, and then even those who were born to British parents were on top, and then the Boers, which is the Dutch word for farmer, and then of course anybody else. So there were signs posted everywhere. They were very open about their apartheid. They were very open about their racism. So here are a couple of here's a sign that was actually located in South Africa. It says, "Danger, natives, Indians, and coloreds. If you enter these premises at night, you will be listed as missing. Armed guards shoot on sight. Savage dogs devour the corpse. You have been warned." This is on a beach. People who were native South African weren't allowed to visit the beaches. They had to stay in specific areas. They weren't even allowed to be on the streets after a certain period of time, after a certain time of day. They weren't allowed to use the same sidewalks as a white person. The whole thing was racially segregated, and it was wrong. Absolutely wrong. Apartheid needed to be dealt with, and it needed to be dealt with by the people of South Africa. But the hard part was that the people who were being affected the most by apartheid were the people who weren't allowed to vote and had no rights. That is why people like Nelson Mandela performed acts of violence instead. There's a frustration there. And he, of course, was being taught how to do this by other people from communist nations saying, this is how you do this, but it's destabilizing the government. Now, there are other ways to get nations to change their behavior, and one of those is through sanctions. A sanction is when one country refuses to sell or to trade with another nation because of something they're doing. So the United States imposed economic sanctions on South Africa to discourage apartheid. They were saying, okay, we're not going to send you certain things. We are not going to trade with you in certain things until you correct this really awful behavior. And so this is one of the advertisements that went around the world: boycott the products of apartheid. So look before you buy. Where does it come from? Is it coming from South Africa? Then don't buy it. If we don't buy their stuff, they're going to start hurting, and they will start changing their behavior. Just finish up because it doesn't go on. So let's talk about what happened. After a lot of pressure from world leaders, and especially from those who were influenced by MTV and Hollywood, and CNN got on board with that because they're very influenced by MTV and Hollywood. Seriously, they were. The South African government, who had a man named de Klerk as their newest president, they decided that they were going to release Nelson Mandela, and they would work with him to discover how best to get rid of apartheid. So you have a cultural imperative that has to be completely wiped out and rebuilt in a different way so that everybody can have an equal say and equal protection under the law. So de Klerk and Mandela worked together to create a better South Africa. This is around the time when Winnie Mandela got very angry at her husband for even considering working with de Klerk. As far as she was concerned, all the white people should just be killed or kicked out. Nelson Mandela said, no, we are a multicultural nation. We need to start behaving like one. And that's what really prompted their divorce. But de Klerk and Nelson Mandela working together, they were able to have apartheid outlawed in Africa, at least in South Africa, at least on a legal note. There's still going to be racism, and there's still going to be actions of apartheid because it takes a long time for people to change culturally. But they both won the Nobel Peace Prize because of their work together. Now, when the next elections came around, Nelson Mandela was on the ballot. He was the first Black South African and Native South African that would be on the ballot, and he became the very first Black president of South Africa. Okay, by 1989, communists had lost control of Eastern Europe, primarily because the USSR was going bankrupt. We started to see that during Reagan's time and the idea of trying to rebuild with glasnost and perestroika, but it was just too little too late. There was no way back for communism in Russia-led USSR. So the little countries that had been taken over by the USSR were now walking away. They were saying, that's it, we're just going to not be part of the USSR anymore. And let's start with Solidarity. The group Solidarity gained control of the Polish parliament in June, and the Russians didn't stop them. They didn't say, okay, we're going to throw out all the votes of the people who voted for you, and we're going to put our own men in. Russia really didn't do anything. At that point, other nations who were under USSR rule started to perk up and say, USSR isn't doing anything to stop this. So Hungary declared its independence in October. Nothing happened. There was no crushing, fight back. Czechoslovakia rose up against communists in November. East Germany opened the Berlin Wall. That was major. People just realizing that the communists are no longer fighting back. because they didn't have any money to pay their soldiers, they could become independent. They could stand up and say, hey, let's do this. So East Germany opened the Berlin Wall in November. They broke the wall down. It was a weeks-long celebration in Berlin where people were getting on top of the Berlin Wall. They were taking jackhammers. They were using heavy equipment to bring it down. They were using screwdrivers, hammers, levers, whatever it took to start hammering down these walls. Sledgehammers went against that wall, and people started tearing the wall down with their hands and bringing over the wall the people that they had been missing since the wall had gone up. So East and West was once again reunited, and it was pretty amazing. In Romania, Romania had a communist dictator who was more communist than every other communist in the communist world. He believed that communism meant you should be completely walled off from the rest of the world, completely self-contained, and dad burn it, he was going to do it. He was going to show people how real communism worked. So he had no contact with other communist countries. He was running everything on his own. And as a result, he came up with some really bizarre things. People in his country could not even play Scrabble because he thought it was too much part of the intelligentsia. Okay. No. Okay. So it was too smart. People shouldn't be educating themselves at home like that, playing Scrabble. How dare they? He became so strict in controlling every aspect of his nation's moves that eventually his people just rose up against him, having just been frustrated by him controlling every aspect of their life, what they could say, what they could wear, where they could live, what they could eat, what could they watch, what they could play as a board game, that eventually he was just overthrown. He was actually assassinated, as was his wife. And the people of Romania looked at that as a way of fighting for their freedom. Okay, so here is East and West Germany reunited in October of 1990. You can see how people are tearing that wall down, whatever it took. By then, every East European nation considered itself independent of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union didn't fight back. They had no money to actually organize and mobilize. Now, people who were from Berlin, either west, east or west, this was a moment of pride and excitement. Around the world, people were excited for the people of Berlin and this wall coming down. Like I said, it was like a week-long party. And you better believe MTV was there to cover it. And it was exciting. This is an exciting moment in our history. Okay, so Gorbachev was no longer president of the USSR because the USSR ceased to exist. Now they were back to the country of Russia with no Soviet satellites at all. And satellite meaning the states. That's what a Soviet is. It's a state. So Boris Yeltsin became the new president of the Russian Republic. Did you catch the word republic? Now, the USSR was also supposed to be a republic, but they didn't do a very good job representing the people. It was basically just the Communist Party representing themselves towards the people. So here is the president of the Russian Republic. He resigned from the Communist Party, and the party attempted a coup. That means they tried to take over again, but they failed. So the Soviet Union ceased to exist as a nation. But you have to keep in mind that this man, even though he is now the president of the Russian Republic, was a former communist, and it's going to take a long time for people to understand how not to be a communist country. It's going to take them quite a long time to get that. Plus the fact that they were pretty much broke when they became the brand new nation of Russia once again. Okay, by December of 1991, 11 of the former Soviet republics banded together and voluntarily joined Russia in the Commonwealth of Independent States. Why? Because it was really hard to do things on their own. They didn't have the trade routes set up. They didn't have infrastructure. They had been under communist rule for so many years that they really didn't understand how to run their own countries anymore. They had always been run by communist leaders, and people didn't know what to do. So they went back to what was familiar to them, even though what was familiar to them had put them in really bad positions in the past. It's sad, but it's a common human trait. Okay, we're going to stop right there today. We are going to, let's see. Yep, that's a perfect place to stop. And we'll pick up again tomorrow's Wednesday. So that's our catch up day, my catch up day, as well as your catch up day. So we'll pick up again on Thursday. Don't forget to do your homework a little bit at a time. And I will talk to you on Thursday. Have a really good day.